Hello and welcome to Delta College Impact. I'm Roger Waller, your host for today's program. And I should tell you, recently we had a book signing here at the Delta College bookstore. And it was really exciting for us because it was two of our own faculty who were signing books that they had written. And we're going to be talking with both those authors today on Impact. And our first author is Dr. Steve Talbot of our History, Poli-Sci, and Fine Arts Division. And one of the things that we should talk about is, Steve, let's welcome you a little bit and talk a little bit about your background. And, what area do you teach in? And specifically, what are some of the courses you teach here at Delta College?
Roger, I guess you'd say I'm a, jack of all trades, master of none, or maybe one. But actually, I'm in sociology and anthropology. And sociology is what I mostly teach here at Delta College. But as a matter of fact, my specialty is American Indian Studies. And that's what I've done on some other campuses as well as in anthropology and sociology.
And I should mention that Steve's background includes a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from the University of Oregon and a Master of Arts in Anthropology from the University of Arizona. And finally, you got that Doctorate of Philosophy in Anthropology again from UC Berkeley. And I know as we start to talk about it, one of the things that you do in your class is really relate a lot of your background to the topics that you're talking about. And one of the interesting things in your book, the new book that you've written, Native American Voices, is that it's a reader. And I guess one of the things that we can talk about is what's the difference from a regular textbook and a reader?
Yeah, Roger, a reader, which we use very often in social sciences, sometimes as a supplementary text, although sometimes I've used it as a main text, has the good point is that it's a series of selections from a number of authors. So with the reader, you can select out what you think are some of the more significant and readable articles for students. And that's why we produce this reader as a college text in that sense.
And one of the other things I think we should mention about Steve is that this isn't your first book. You've written a number of textbooks about Native Americans, and I think one of the things that we can think about is what is it that generated your interest in Native American history?
Let me just point out, Roger, that actually this is the first textbooks I've written. The other have been just books about Native Americans or articles, academic articles, newspaper articles, and so forth.
And as you can see on your screen right now are a variety of the books that Steve has written about. And I guess one of the things, Steve, that I found interesting is a lot of people think about Dances with Wolves and some of the romanticized pictures of Native Americans, and yet you've taken more of a current view of some of the challenges faced by Native Americans. What caused you to take this perspective as you started to develop your books?
Well, in this book we concentrate more on the social sciences and not so much on literature, poetry, and other subjects about which there are a lot of very good and interesting Indian books, but we felt compelled to get more of the political, the contemporary struggle, the contemporary issues, as well as some of the history and background. And I suppose it's been shaped by too many years in Indian affairs. I've worked for various Indian tribes in the Southwest. I've worked for an Indian college program in Alaska. I've was involved in the Alcatraz occupation back in '69 and was one of the first teachers in the Ethnic Studies Department at Berkeley back in the late '60s and early '70s. So I think being immersed into contemporary issues like working on reservations, working with intertribal councils and things of that sort, my focus has always been more towards the political, the economic, the social, the cultural in that sense, and maybe not what you would think is the typical anthropological interest in dead cultures or something like that, because of course it's a very living, very viable society and culture that we're talking about.
And I know as we look at it, you can start to think about Native American issues. Are they regionally different from a standpoint of Eastern tribes versus Western tribes, or are there some similar challenges that run through Native American culture?
It's a good question, Roger. There's really a lot of similarities, and we have to understand that there is no such thing as the American Indian, that these are really small or mini nationalities with many different languages, many different customs, small nations, if you will, like Liechtenstein or something like that in Europe, San Marino or whatever. But even once having said that, they are peoples that are much more closer to the land. They have a lot of common terms, spirituality. Of course, their interaction with U.S. history and oppression has been very similar. All are very interested in treaty relationships. So there are a lot of common problems and a lot of common interests. It's really true.
And it's interesting as you look at different regions, and I know your studying has covered the country from a standpoint of items that you've collected, items that you've identified, items that you take into the classroom. And I know we have a special medallion in front of us here, and we might talk a little bit about some of the story behind that and exactly what's involved in that.
Yes, this was given to me by Iroquois friends some years ago, and this has to do with the Iroquois, or Six Nations tribes in the East, and originally in upper state New York. Nations like the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Oneida, and the Onondaga, and later the Tuscarora. And actually there's new evidence now by revisionist historians, as they are called, by Indian academics and so forth, that actually the influence of these early Eastern Indian confederacies, and particularly the Iroquois Confederacy, that there was tremendous influence upon our early form of government. Many of our founding fathers spoke Indian languages. They interacted with Iroquois people. The suffragette movement took a lot of their interest from the freedom they saw, the personal freedom of Indian women in some of those confederacies, such as the right to vote, suffrage, which early white women didn't have, but Indians did have in their own societies. So through Madison's papers and a lot of other documentary research, we find that there was a lot of influence upon our form of democracy from these Indian groups.
Now, when you go in and do your research, what's the process that you, is it like you call ahead and say, I'm coming, or how do you actually make that initial entree? Because I would imagine there's a lot of hesitancy of being accepted by the variety of tribes that you've contacted.
Well, generally speaking, the old method of the early anthropologists is still done in some quarters, but I've always been involved in actually working for Indian groups, and my co-author, Dr. Susan Lobo, is very active in that field. She's a contract researcher or anthropologist by training, but she works for Indian tribes and Indian peoples, and married an Indian fellow I used to work with. Her daughter is Indian, and so it's being part of the Indian community and recognized as part of the Indian community that I think is really key. Some of us have some Indian heritage, which is meaningful to Indian people. Others of us don't, but we take a partisan or advocacy into the research that is needed.
I know one of the challenges that we're starting to read in a variety of newspaper articles really deals with the development of the economic structure of tribes now, and the use of gaming as an issue, that we start to see a lot of discussion about casinos, and casinos really occurring across the country now. What's your view of the development of the casino issue as it relates to Native Americans?
Yeah, that's I know I've been asked recently by 10 or a dozen people here on campus about new propositions on the ballot and the whole issue of gaming. First of all, gaming is an old Indian American pursuit. This is something people did for a long time. Just recently at Big Time up at Grinding Rock near Jackson at their big annual celebration up there, you could see the old gaming, the song, the betting and so forth that still goes on between the various villages. So it's an old tradition among American Indians, but as a matter of fact, the kind of gaming we're talking about, particularly with electronic videos and so forth, is kind of a window of opportunity for peoples who have not been allowed the kind of economic development they should, have too much poverty, too high unemployment and so forth. It's given some tribes that are positioned geographically well enough and they can afford to get into gaming some way of raising revenue, so that they can get on welfare, build tribal housing for elders, develop health programs, college scholarships. And for the few tribes that are able to take advantage of that, that seems to have been a real help. it's a slippery slope because there are some negative possibilities around, just gambling fever for the wider community and for an economy that's based completely on just one kind of economic opportunity. Becomes kind of a distorted economy. But if they do it wisely and correctly, it can and will be a real assistance.
Are there any what you'd call model tribes from a standpoint of having a good system of maintaining their culture and yet having the good economic base from which they can build and maintain that culture?
Well, there are some tribes in the Northwest that have gotten into fish aquaculture, and there have been some others. Navajo Nation is very large. Generally speaking, the economic development issue is an uphill one, and tribes and nations that are pretty weak politically, don't have much political clout, which most of them do not have, are subject to toxic waste dumping, garbage sites, strip mining, things that are very destructive ecologically and environmentally. So it's been a very big issue in the Native American community, and it's one that's being struggled with right now among the various nations.
Now, do you have any projects in the works right now, Steve?
Well, my interest in doing this present book is something I'm continuing with another book on the drawing board. What I've noticed is that there are many good and interesting Indian books, and particularly in history and literature, but there are no textbooks that you can teach a course with, except if you go to the anthropology books about American Indians. There are some problems with the typical anthropology books, with which I'm well familiar, being trained in anthropology. One of them is that they never take a hemispheric approach. Somehow Indians fall off the map either at Canada or the Mexican border. And of course, Indians are throughout the Americas, perhaps 50 million people. And so this book and the next textbook that I'm working on, we take a hemispheric approach. We concentrate on the United States and Canada, but we try to broaden it a little more than that.
Well, I tell you, Steve, we can talk for a lot longer about this topic, and I really want to thank you for joining us. And I encourage you to drop by the Delta Bookstore and check out Native American Voices, or you can contact Dr. Stephen Talbot here at Delta College, and you can call him at area code 209-954-5606. And we certainly encourage you to take one of Steve's classes and learn a little bit more about this topic and get more into learning about Native Americans. So stay tuned. After a brief public service message, we're going to be back with another one of our writers, Anna Villegas of our communication skills, and we're going to talk with her about her new book and her previous writing. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
From the past they come. Dinosaurs. Journey back to a primitive time when Tyrannosaurus ruled the earth. Meet prehistoric predators up close and personal, if you dare. See the fossil exhibit Footsteps Through Time at Stockton's Clever Planetarium.
Welcome back to Delta College Impact. I'm Roger Waller, your host for today's program. On the first half of the program, we talked with Steve Talbot of our Social Science Division about his book concerning Native Americans. On the second half of the program, we're joined by Anna Villegas of our Communication Skills Department, and Anna is also an author. And what I should do is congratulate you on your second novel, which is entitled Swimming Lessons. But before we talk about the book and the creative process, Anna, let's talk a little bit about what you do here at Delta College in the Communication Skills Department.
Well, I teach the range of composition classes. I teach creative writing, short story, and poetry. I teach lit classes, so I'm kind of an all-around English teacher.
And I'll tell you, it has to be exciting for you who teach creative writing to actually get into that process and actually start to become that author and doing creative writing. Now, before we talk specifically about the books, I think it's kind of interesting for anyone who's sitting out there to think about what it is that gets you to become that novelist. Do you start writing short stories first, or what's the process that you go through?
I did, and I think most novelists would tell you that's how they started. I think we're kind of these weird people who watch others a lot, and we're curious about what makes people tick, and we make up stories to answer those questions. And I certainly wrote 20 years of short stories before I wrote a novel. Yeah.
And so actually you had been sort of getting this work done. And what was it that was that catalyst that said, all right, now I'm going to start to do the big book, the novel?
You know, I may repeat myself. I was on the Impact and I told this story, but I'll tell it again. I was inspired by the bridges of Madison County. I saw this guy write this book and really earn his independence to write whatever he wanted. So my first book was inspired partly by, you know, a desire to see if I could do it, to see if I could break into that industry, which is, I guess, is okay reason.
Oh, I tell you, it's a big challenge. And I know when we start to talk about swimming lessons, which is your second book, you know, obviously it's a departure from your first book because you did a co-authoring work on it. And what was it that generated the decision to do book number 2?
Book number 2 was really a circumstance of sort of happy fortune. I was working on my second individual novel, and my literary agent gave my name and number to another novelist who was looking for an agent. And in fact, I remember Lynn Hugo, my collaborator, called and left a message on my voicemail. And I thought, I don't want to do this. It's not my job to represent my agent. And I didn't return her call, and she called again. And our first phone call went over an hour, and we weren't talking about the agent. We were just talking about our writing lives and what we'd done, and became friends over the phone, started exchanging our work for criticism. And after about a year of this phone and fax and email friendship, one of us said, you know, look at all these letters we've written. We could have written a novel together. And that's really how it started.
And I know one of the unique things, we had a chance to see Lynn Hugo's picture on the television here, along with your own. Now, it's kind of interesting because you collaborated on this book, and yet have you ever personally met?
We haven't met, and you'll notice that her background is a little classier than mine in the picture. She's standing on Cape Cod, the Atlantic is roaring behind her, and I'm standing at Lodi Lake with the McCollum Slough behind me. She lives in Ohio, and we haven't met, no.
That's amazing that you've been able to collaborate on a book. Now, what's the process that you go through to really mesh together a novel versus, as we talked about with Steve, readings from a variety of authors, but how'd you do that creative process?
We started with the seed of a plot. We wanted to have these two very different women who were drawn together because they happened to be in love with the same man, and we really started with our characters. So we had this vague notion of a plot that would get resolved a certain way, and we said, okay, who's your character? And Lynn said, I'll be this, and Anna said, I'll be this character, and we wrote our first chapters, and it was kind of a magic moment when we sent faxed the chapters to each other, and I met Laurel, and she met Marna, and we knew we had a book in these women that we'd invented.
Now, how'd you invent the guy that they both were in love with?
He's a very nice guy. He was my character's husband, actually, and we had this, we didn't want to vilify him. We didn't want to make him a Clinton-esque kind of nefarious two-timer. He's a nice guy that made a bad decision and therefore deserved the love of both these women. So we were violating some genre fiction rules, and that he's not a bad guy. He is lovable. And I guess he's a composite of the traits of many real people.
Now, as you start to think about putting this together, and chapter 1 starts to mesh together, how do you get to chapter 2?
We got technical. We got a storyboard. We posted by our respective computers a plot storyboard which said this happens here, and our chapters would leapfrog. So Lynn would write a chapter that got us through some event we'd said had to happen, and then I'd write the next chapter with my character's rendition of that event. So we were in real close contact with the plotting stuff.
Now, when you start to put the words on paper, and I have to say that that's the challenge. You know, it was a dark and stormy night. I guess stops selling after a while. How do you start to get the flow of the words? And as teaching creative writing, I know that's probably a real challenge for a lot of students. But is there a process that you go through?
You know, it's the creative process. I think it's the same whether you're an anthropologist or you're a scientist. And it really is this: perspiration begets inspiration. And I am a sitter at my computer and stare for long periods of time. I look at the blank screen, but the more you write and the more you develop that habit of sitting down every morning, for me it's the summers and writing, the story begins to take shape. It's never easy, and I often think of it as terrible anguish. I mean, I'm not sure why I do it to myself. My students will tell me that too. No more, Mrs. Villegas.
Stop now.
Yeah.
Now, do you find yourself as you go traveling to places that you think about now what you're looking at more as seen and in descriptive terms, or do you find yourself still being a tourist and not thinking about how to put it on paper?
Oh, I understand your question. I am always a watcher, and in fact, it's people, so it's the people in the places. You could sit me down in the Greyhound bus station for 2 hours and I wouldn't be bored. Lynn, my collaborator, is a much more point of fact, get those details right, but I'm more what's going on in that person's head. So I've always watched people, and I know this is a psychiatric disturbance of some kind. I would rather be on the periphery and watching people.
Now, this is a tough one because I'm going to sort of take you to your first book a little bit. We'll go in reverse order here, because you've talked about some of the challenges of collaboration. Now, your first book that was entitled All We Know of Heaven is really a much more, it covers a serious topic, and yet it's still a romantic novel to a large degree. What was it that said, was it you had read Bridges of Madison County and you said, I think I could do something similar, or what was the difference that you wanted to do?
It was exactly that. I read that story, and one of the things, if you want to write a novel and have someone buy it, you have to think of the market. So Bridges and other books like that told me, boy, you know, there's a market for middle-aged romance, and I think I could do that as well as Bobby Waller did. So, yeah, but my characters were my own, and their situation was one that I invented. So it was genre fiction in that sense.
So as you started to put that together, did you use that same storyboard technique of saying, here's what I want to happen?
Yes, although individually your characters will get away from you and they'll start saying, oh yeah, you think I'm going to do that in that chapter. Well, I've got other plans, which is part of the magic of fiction.
Now, you always hear stories about, oh, this author sits down and bangs out a book in a couple weeks, secluded in a cabin up in the Sierras or something like this. What was your secret to getting the book done, and how long did it take you?
You know, it was due dates, the same that I give my student. If you've got a due date, you'll get it done. And swimming lessons, I guess you could say I wrote half of a novel in about a year's time. And remember, in that year's time, I'm also teaching a full load. But it's really just taking every free moment you have and sitting down and spending long days at the computer.
Do you have to do a lot of rereading of what you've done previous?
I am. Actually, I always, my pattern is to begin the day by redoing what's happened the day before. I'm constantly working through and up to where I am. Other writers don't do that, but that's my habit.
Has your writing of a novel and doing the writings in this fashion, has it changed your teaching of creative writing?
I would say in kind of a global sense, it reminds me, no matter if you're experienced or novice, every time you write a new piece, you come to it anew, and the challenges are fresh again. And I think I do a fairly good job as a teacher of not expecting my students to recognize, the process, that I can take them through the process every time. it reminds you how hard it is.
I was going to say, now, after you finish book 2, do you sit there and say, I'm never doing this again? You know, 1 was plenty, 2 is a lot, and I'm never going to do it again? Or is it the type of thing that you have a period of catching your breath and then you say, well, I think there's another one out there?
Boy, you get on that roll and you think, how do I suffer the anxiety of knowing whether or not an editor's going to buy this book? And the best way to get through that is to start another book. So book 3 is done.
Oh,
now.
is that
Yeah.
right? Oh.
Yeah.
Now, we should, I mean, we could always talk about a whole show on this process of dealing with an editor and a publisher. Is that like a marriage also? Is it a up and down relationship as you work with your publisher?
You know, publishing isn't what it was when Ernest Hemingway was writing. There are no Maxwell Perkins out there editing. I had a wonderful editor with my first book. I had a really non-English person as an editor for swimming lessons. So it's the luck of the draw, sort of. But
Well, it sounds like you've had a great relationship, and we want to encourage everybody to go out and get the novel Swimming Lessons, written by Lynn Hugo and our own Anna Villegas. And we certainly want to encourage you not only to do that, but also to think about taking a course from Anna here at Delta College. And you can find out more about not only Anna's books, but some of the courses by contacting Anna here at Delta at phone number 954-5456. And certainly check out our course catalog for courses by either Anna Villegas or Steve Talbot, who we talked with on the first half of the program. And I've got to say, Anna, as you look at the creative process, and I think a lot of us are so envious of what you've done, because it takes a lot of effort to do this, and we want to thank you for joining us on Delta College Impact. I want to thank Steve Talbot for joining us on the first half, and I want to thank you for watching, and I hope we've piqued your interest about writing and some of the courses here at Delta College and some of the great faculty we have here at Delta. So I want to thank you all for watching Delta College Impact, and we encourage you to tune in for future issues and editions of Impact. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.